Have you ever heard about the Swedish poet who went insane? Gustaf Fröding is one of the most celebrated and famous poets in Swedish history. He lived between 1860 to 1911, and he became famous for his very light-hearted poems, often depicting life in Western Sweden, which is where I'm at and where he was also from, where he spent a significant amount of his life. But he also describes things like the beauty of nature in some of his most famous poems. In one of them, called I ungdomen, or In Youth in Swedish, he says, "Det glittrar så gnistrande vackert i ån, det kvittrar så lustigt i furen. Här ligger jag lat som en bortskämd son i knät på min moder naturen. Det sjunger och doftar och lyser och ler från jorden och himlen och allt jag ser." Now, despite these very beautiful poems, Fröding also had a very hard and difficult life. He suffered terribly from anxiety, depression, and an alcoholism that resulted from these things, right? And this condition only got worse over time, to the point that for the last 2 decades, and especially the last decade of his life, he spent basically most of his time in a mental institution, because this mental illness of his was just getting worse. And his poetry also seems to have been influenced by these events, right? We see in the later outputs of his career that he starts exploring themes more of religious philosophy and things like mysticism. We know from his private letters to his sisters and to his private library that he studied various different traditions, including the writings of people like Madame Blavatsky, Helena Blavatsky, and the Theosophical Society. This was a very significant movement primarily in the late 19th century that sought a kind of perennial truth in all the different religious traditions of the world. And it seems that Fröding was very much inspired by these ideas. Because in his poetry, we start seeing references to everything from Platonism to Buddhism and concepts like nirvana, which he probably would have picked up from writings by the Theosophical Society, for example. And in these later poems, he starts exploring what could be called a kind of monistic philosophy, where there's a oneness or unity behind multiplicity that unifies all contradictions, all contraries, everything from good to bad, or good and bad, even God and Satan, all is unified in this one concept. And the language that he uses, the symbol that he uses for this oneness, is the Grail, the Holy Grail. Very powerful image. And also then talks about things like the Grail Knight, which is some kind of salvific figure that is to come and bring salvation in the future. Now it seems that this figure rather maybe represents some kind of personal awakening to this unity and this salvation in some way. But regardless, these themes of the Grail are very prominent in his later writings, especially in the last published work of poetry that he published, which is called Grailstänk, which in English means something like splashes from the Grail. This is a work of poetry, a suite of poems that almost exclusively explores these themes, and it's very beautiful. I think a lot of other people also think that this is also probably a very personal thing for Fröding, because he was suffering so much from these feelings of anxiety, especially feelings of guilt in his own life, that it was also a sense of finding this unifying or this oneness in all things, in which good and bad could be unified, in which he could sort of disappear and become annihilated himself to sort of relieve that pain and that suffering that he was feeling. So aside from being a very profound philosophical, metaphysical expression in that sense, it seems like it was also very personal to Fröding. I think this language of the Grail is very beautiful. It's very unique, especially. We've heard these themes about oneness and annihilation, all these things, a lot of times throughout the history of religion and philosophy and mysticism. But the language that he uses with the Grail and all these things, that's quite unique, and I think it's very beautiful in that way. Now, because of this, I was actually inspired by these poems to write a song of my own, and actually released that song very recently, called Grailstänk, again, splashes from the Grail. I was inspired by the language and the themes that he explores in his poetry to write a song in my own language, basically, but with the same themes. And I think it turned out pretty well. So check that out if you're interested in hearing some of these themes and ideas put to music in a modern pop rock with folk influenced song. There will be links to that. You can find links to my link tree in the description or in my bio, where you'll find that song and all the streaming platforms and on YouTube. So go check that out.
Det nalkas från ett hus någonstans, ett härligt försonande ljud, berusande dans, och jag blir som i trans.